I'm Pierre.
And I'm Dana Lee.
And we'd like to tell you about a week-long trip to Cuba that we did in February 2026. This trip came about when I was cruising the web in November, thinking about winter getaways, and I came across this website describing a Cuba walking tour. We'd enjoyed visiting Caribbean islands in the past, but that was mostly for water-based activities. And here was a chance to visit the largest Caribbean island on this Cuba Unbound guided tour.
We knew that there were all kinds of restrictions for Americans traveling to Cuba, but a phone call to the Cuba Unbound office assured us that this tour conformed to current regulations for American visits, since it was designated to benefit the Cuban people. We were certainly happy with that.
The Cuba Unbound office agreed to set up a tour just for the two of us, with a guide and a driver for the week. So we said, this sounds great, let's go for it. The Cuba Unbound folks sent us a detailed itinerary of our week's tour. Here is a Google Earth-based map showing our route during the course of our week in Cuba. The tour began and ended in Havana, just a short flight from Miami. The red dots show our overnight stay locations scattered around the eastern part of Cuba, and pink dots indicate additional daytime stops. Since our tour started in Havana at 9 in the morning, we booked an American Airlines flight from Miami to Havana the day before. We then went up on the Airbnb website and reserved a room in this, quote, hostel boarding house, unquote, in the old part of Havana for our first night's accommodations. Americans are not allowed to stay in government hotels, but this was a privately owned B&B. Here we're looking at a Google Earth view of Havana, which you can see is a big city. Its population is about 2 million, and that's out of a total of 10 million in Cuba. It's interesting that there are almost as many Cuban Americans living in Florida as there are Havana residents. Anyway, this aerial view shows the airport with a big red dot on the left, and our Airbnb at that big red dot next to the Havana port, which turns out to be about half an hour taxi ride. Our arrival was simple, as we were the only plane at the airport when we landed. We handed over the visas that Cuba Unbound had sent us, picked up our luggage, found a taxi to the B&B right away at $20 US. It turns out that Cubans really want US dollars because their Cuban pesos are really pretty much worthless. Here's our bedroom at that, quote, hostel boarding house, unquote. We've stayed at a whole bunch of B&Bs, and I have to say, this was probably the most beautiful and spacious room ever. We had a terrific English-speaking host who showed us a great little restaurant right around the corner, and he served us a nice breakfast with Cuban coffee the next morning. Here we are after coffee, looking out from our balcony to the narrow street below. The building of our Airbnb was constructed in 1894, along with this whole neighborhood. Not everything was restored as beautifully as our building, but you really can see the neighborhood as it was 120 years ago.
Here we are at 9 o'clock that morning starting our tour. You see me out there getting our luggage into that yellow taxi, which we will be riding in for the next week. We've just met Werlene, our guide, and Yamir, our driver. The taxi is a Lada, a Russian-made car purchased by the Cuban government some decades ago. Yamir rents that car from the government for his private taxi business. Both Werlene and Yamir are totally fluent in English, and she is a university graduate who speaks 4 languages. Over the next week, they would be explaining everything we were seeing out the window, life in Cuba, its rich history, and answering all of our questions.
For our first day, we headed west, first through city streets, then for about 2 hours on a 4-lane major highway to get to our first national park stop. Here we are that first morning in the back seat of our car with our guide Gwilyn in front explaining what we're seeing. There was surprisingly little traffic coming and going into Cuba's largest city. That was thanks to the U.S. imposed fuel shortage, And here we are passing a service station with cars waiting for fuel lined up out onto the highway. As we went further along the highway, we noticed scenes like this at pretty much every overpass. Those people are hitchhikers looking for rides, some of them waving pesos. We saw all kinds of people out there, including families with children. In this case, a truck had stopped for some of the riders. Here we are in our first national park with our very knowledgeable local guide. This park was a previous coffee farm area that had been reforested about 30 years ago by the Cuban government. Here our guide is explaining one of the many flowering trees to Dan Lee. We walked on trails through this hardwood forest, and there were lots of birds, including many North American migrants. Our guide showed us the Cuban tody, Cuba's national bird, displaying the red, white, and blue colors of the Cuban flag. After lunch, we went up to a terraced area where coffee beans were formerly laid out in the sun to dry, as explained by Guerline.
Here's Pierre pushing the wheel that's used for grinding dried coffee beans, probably with slaves originally pushing the grinder.
Donnelly is standing next to a gumbo limbo tree with its red peeling bark. That bark gives the gumbo limbo its other name, the tourist tree. But tourist Donnelly uses sunblock religiously, so she's never going to look like that tree bark. During our tour, we mostly stayed in privately owned houses with a maximum of 4 bedrooms that serve as B&Bs. In some of them, like this one, they also served us home-cooked dinners featuring local foods. We were the only guests here that night, and we got to explore the yard behind the house. We walked around the backyard looking up at bananas and jackfruit in the trees above. Here's Dan Lee checking out the pig pen while ignoring the dozen or so chickens running around the yard. That backyard also had lots of blooms. A shower had just passed through, giving us a rainbow behind the neighborhood coconut palms. Horse-driven carts were a significant part of the traffic on roads around villages and suburbs everywhere in Cuba. For our second day, we were back on a taxi, heading west to our second national park in the town of Vinales. Here we are just off the main highway, heading north into Vinales and seeing this group of hitchhikers looking for a ride into town. Just before the town, we encountered our first roadside billboard. That's Cuba's Revolutionary War hero Che Guevara up there, reminding people that his dreams had no borders. After the revolution, Che went on to advocate and assist revolutionary movements in Latin America and Africa, but he never achieved the success he had with Fidel Castro. Now we're just getting into Vinales National Park, and that's a government hotel with its big swimming pool right there at the park entrance. That, of course, is a no-no for us Yankees, and of course we stayed that night in a privately owned B&B in town. But you can see here that nice row of limestone hills in the background with many steep slopes containing a very scenic valley where the park is located. This valley has traditionally been known for its tobacco agriculture, and you can see some of those fields here. The park is dedicated to maintaining traditional methods of growing tobacco and making cigars. For the traditional farmers here, Cuba's fuel shortage is no problem since those oxen don't use it. Cattle egrets are happy to find critters turned up by the plowing. I wonder how many other places in the world you can still see oxen plowing fields. Here's a field of young tobacco planted several months ago, but still a long way from harvest. Here's a tobacco drying shed where tobacco leaves are hung for months to dry out before they're rolled into cigars.
The cigar-making process was explained by one of the farmers who finished his talk by rolling some of those dried leaves into this cigar. Neither Pierre nor I have any cigar smoking experience, so we were not in any position to take a few puffs and make any judgments. These farmers are growing and harvesting tobacco on government lands, so they're required to sell 90% of their tobacco to the government at what they told us was very low prices. However, they are entitled to keep 10% of their harvest for their personal cigar production, and they assured us that their cigars are the best in the world. We later saw the government's industrial cigar production in a warehouse with 12 ladies sitting at tables, splitting leaves and discarding bad ones. In that area, we also saw piles and piles of tobacco getting ready for production.
After spending most of the day in the park, we went into Vinales town and walked around. Here's the town square with its old church, but there was not much activity here, just a few kids with skateboards. Several small shops on the main street were mostly closed, but there were semi-active fruit and vegetable markets in the side streets. Our B&B was down one of these, and we later walked into town to a small restaurant for a very good dinner. The next day, it was back on that main highway for about 3 hours as we headed towards the Havana suburbs for our next stop. It was the former home of famous American writer Ernest Hemingway. Before getting there, we stopped off at our driver Yamir's house to fill up our gas tank. He had several large plastic jugs filled with gasoline in his garage, which he brought out to the car, siphoning off enough fuel for our next couple days. Like a lot of goods, when supplies get short, a black market comes to life, and these Cubans are very creative and resilient people. They're getting along in a system struggling to provide many things we Americans take for granted. This Hemingway bus greets visitors near his house. He loved Cuban culture, wrote many of his books and stories here, and really liked the nearby Havana bars, as well as the big game fishing opportunities in easy reach. Here we're sitting on the front porch of Hemingway's house, which we could look into but not go inside. But great care has been made to restore the house as it was 70 years ago. We walked around and looked through the house's many windows. Here's the bedroom shared by at least 3 of his wives. This is the library where he did much of his writing. His famous novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls, about the Spanish Civil War, was written here. Next to the house is a tower with a lookout lounge on top. The property is named Finca Vigia, which means lookout farm. From that lookout, Hemingway could look out over Havana and the Gulf of Florida beyond. Hemingway's deep-sea fishing boat Pilar, also preserved, is in the yard, and his time on the Pilar was his inspiration for The Old Man and the Sea.
You can see the fighting chair where Hemingway caught marlin and tuna. He once met Fidel Castro at a Havana fishing tournament.
After lunch, it was back on the road, heading for Cuba's south coast, with a first stop at the head of the famous Bay of Pigs and Cuba's largest national park. Here's a look at the road as we headed south, leaving the Havana area, giving you an idea of the interesting mix of vehicles we are seeing every day. And a bit further along, in areas with scattered small farms, we're seeing more of these horse-drawn carts on the road. Nearing the Bay of Pigs, we stopped at the shop with hummingbird feeders, where we got to see bee hummingbirds. These are the world's smallest birds, and they're found only in Cuba. Here's my video with motion slowed down 4 times. We then drove to our next Casa Particular, as they're known, which was in Playa Larga, a small beach town at the head of the Bay of Pigs. Here's my beach view after a 15-minute walk from our casa, with Playa Larga in the distance. Some coconuts drop from the trees and sprout, but this one washed up on the beach. A bit closer to town, some of the locals were working on their fishing boat. Here's our guide Berlin with Dan Lee, enjoying a home-cooked local seafood dinner prepared by our casa host. You're seeing lobster, fish, and Cuban beer, much appreciated.
The next morning, we drove up to a nearby corner of the immense Ciénaga de Zapata Park. We were in a highly specialized habitat with an eroded limestone surface, thickly vegetated with a few tree species, and many sinkholes, such as this one. Trails were very rough in spots, and while our guide showed us some of the local birds, nothing could top yesterday's bee hummingbirds. One of the sinkholes had crystal clear water where we saw this Cuban crocodile. This is a freshwater species, smaller than the saltwater American crocodiles, which do occur elsewhere in the park. From the Ciénaga de Zapata Park, it was only a short drive to our next stop in the town of Giron, which is a Cuban landmark near the Bay of Pigs. Giron is where in 1961, Cuba's revolutionary leader Fidel Castro and his army defeated the ill-fated CIA-sponsored invasion by Cuban paramilitary exiles trying to overthrow Fidel's new leftist government.
In Giron, we visited the museum presenting many details of the three-day invasion and Cuba's decisive victory. Here you're seeing one of the planes supporting the invasion, launched from an American aircraft carrier but painted with Cuban flags to foil anti-aircraft fire. The museum pointed out how this was a clear false flag violation of international law. Then it was on the road for another 2-hour drive to the city of Trinidad on the south coast. This is historically the center of Cuba's sugar industry in the 18th and 19th centuries. Here we are in the Trinidad town square, looking at the many 19th century buildings now beautifully restored. These are the original cobblestones you see, and while that horse is used to walking on them, my feet were not. The nearby back streets had nicely renovated historic homes, but we didn't see a lot of activity. Here's Dan Lee under one of the tree ferns in the backyard of the handsome Casa Particular where we stayed. The southern coast of Cuba gets a lot of rainfall, but is vulnerable to hurricanes, and the stone construction of Trinidad's historic buildings have survived dozens of damaging hits over the centuries. The next day featured a visit to the rugged mountain area north of Trinidad, and we drove up to the forested national park area over 1,000 feet above Trinidad.
On that road up to the park, we passed a small village where we stopped for one of our Support the Cuban People visits, a regular feature of the tour we were on. Here, our guide, Berlin, is explaining this to a local mother and daughter as I'm giving them a packet of personal hygiene products and Crayolas for children. Cubans in villages like this are really suffering from the severely depressed Cuban economy, and they were very grateful for these small gifts.
Here the road has taken us up to near the park entrance, and we stopped to look back over Trinidad and the Caribbean. The park features many rushing mountain streams surrounded by thick tropical vegetation. This was by far the roughest trail we had on our walking tour. The limestone surface was steep and eroded. Here we passed an interesting cave, which we looked into, but it was dark in there and we didn't see anything. There were birds around, and we saw the small and highly active, beautiful Cuban toady, with its green back blending nicely into the leaves above. A small snake looked out at us from a crack in the limestone, but Cuba has no venomous snakes. After that mountain hike, we drove down to a coastal tourist beach near Trinidad with a good breeze blowing and no tourists to be seen. Here's a local fisherman's marina and shipyard. Trinidad's development was historically limited by the lack of a good harbor for ships to export its large sugar production. We then went back to Trinidad for a second night at our Casa Particular and a nice local paladar restaurant with musicians. In spite of Trinidad's designation as a historic tourist city, we saw few of any tourists while we were visiting.
The next morning, we drove back westwards along the coast for an hour to the Bay of Agua, as shown here. We stopped at a site that set us up with a two-person kayak and a local guide, and, as shown in orange, we paddled into the bay's entrance channel and over to a dramatic historic castle.
After an hour of paddling, we landed near the castle and walked up to it through the small town nearby. As we approached, we could see that this was a fortified castle, and we entered via a drawbridge over what's now a dry moat between the outer wall and the castle itself.
The castle is partially restored with some of the original cannons pointing out into the channel. They were protecting Agua Bay against pirate attacks, which were occurring over a period of centuries. Inside the castle, we found this model of an 18th century Spanish Navy ship protecting Spanish colonies from pirates and also from the British. Nearby, I also found an interesting cedar chest, which they used to put their clothes in order to remove odor, and I lifted the lid and could still smell the cedar.
Walking back through the town near the castle, we saw this cart parked in front of one of the houses. The cart contained large white plastic bags, which we saw being delivered to the house. Our guide explained this was charcoal. Many kitchen stoves in the area use propane, which is increasingly difficult to get these days, so charcoal stoves are one solution. Here we are kayaking back in the channel near the castle, waiting near the shore while this empty tanker passed by, departing from the port of Cienfuegos in Agua Bay. Our kayak guide said several tankers like this that had formerly carried oil to Cuba from Venezuela have been sitting empty for some weeks anchored in the bay. Here I am, enjoying a refreshing pineapple rum drink with the Agua Bay in the background.
After lunch, we drove around the Bay of Agua to the historic port city of Cienfuegos.
We first stopped at this historic large arboretum near Cienfuegos. Here you see our local guide explaining one of the over 2,000 different tropical plant species growing here. Now managed by the Cuban government, the garden was established in 1899 by a Boston sugar magnate. He wanted Harvard botanists to develop disease-resistant strains of sugarcane. In the early 20th century, this became the Harvard Botanic Garden, which developed into the major tropical plant research center in the Western Hemisphere. After the Cuban Revolution, it was taken over by the Cuban government, but recent years have seen a number of collaborative projects emerge between the garden and Harvard scientists. The garden's botanists acquired many specimens of tropical trees from all over the world, and over the years many have grown very large. The regular hurricanes require major maintenance for survival of the varied trees here, but it's a beautiful area for an afternoon hike.
We next drove to the city of Cienfuegos, and you are seeing the town square. Cienfuegos boomed in the 19th century as a center of sugar production. Its location on the Bay of Agua allowed construction of a port that could handle large ships for exporting sugar. Many old town buildings have been restored as the government has tried to encourage tourism.
This impressive theater, built by a sugar magnate in 1890, is a highlight of the restored center of Cienfuegos. Here you see its spectacular large interior, beautifully restored. It was modeled after the Spanish theaters of the era. It's currently being used for various concerts and other events, and I'm sure Fidel has been up there on that stage multiple times. Here's our Cienfuegos Waterside Hotel, located on a peninsula sticking out into the Bay of Yagua. This is one of a handful of privately owned hotels operating in major Cuban tourist areas. Here we are at the hotel's dining area, enjoying our afternoon mojitos. Mojitos are a Cuban tradition, with white rum, sugar, lime juice, and soda water along with mint. We found a few other North American tourists here, which we hadn't seen since Havana. The next morning we got an early start leaving Cienfuegos, driving all the way back to Havana for our final day city tour. We started with a walking tour of Old Havana, and here you're seeing a street not far from our first night's Airbnb. Again, there are narrow streets with 2 to 3 story adjoining houses with balconies. These buildings are over a century old, some restored, but others not so much. Here's Danley in Berlin in the nearby Old Square, in a nicely restored area of the old city near Havana's harbor. While walking around here, we found modern shops and businesses, but some were closed. This square had half a dozen restaurants with outdoor tables. Gwilyn told us that this tourist area was formerly very much busier than what we were seeing. Here's one of the main streets in Old Havana, with covered sidewalks and balconies in all the buildings, some of which had small shops on the first floor. Considering this is downtown Havana on a Saturday afternoon, the traffic is quite light.
As we walked towards the city center with some big modern hotels, we came across one of Havana's hallmark tourist sites, a lineup of dozens of restored American cars. 20 or 30 of these restored cars are often paraded throughout the city. These are mostly convertibles from the 1940s and 1950s. It was fun for us old folks to look at them and recall the cars our families and neighbors had in our childhood. After lunch in the old city, our tour taxi picked us up and drove us to the new part of Havana, to our hotel, for our last night in Cuba. The elegant home behind us is now converted into a small private hotel with a beautiful outdoor patio serving breakfast. After checking in, our guide, Werleen, came to meet us with the Havana tourist taxi you see here, a 1953 Ford convertible with a Hyundai engine. We jumped into the back seat for a 2-hour city tour, and you're going to see some images captured by Pierre's cell phone during that tour.
We started off in a residential section of New Havana, with tree-lined streets and first-floor garages for the closely packed houses. In the center of the city is the national capital of Cuba, built in the 1920s to a design inspired by the U.S. Capitol building in Washington. The Cuban Parliament meets here twice a year, with 470 Communist Party members coming from the country's electoral districts. Here's the main street in the business section of New Havana on Saturday afternoon. Many of the vehicles here are scooters and three-wheelers, and there are also lots of bicycles.
Just west of the old section of Havana is the Plaza de la Revolucion, with the tower named for the Cuban 1890s independence activist José Martí. This plaza is the site of many Communist Party rallies, formerly led by Fidel Castro. Opposite the Martí Tower is the Ministry of the Interior building, with Fidel looking out at the square.
Back in the business section, we see modern apartment buildings mixed in with shops and older churches. There are some solar panels up there on the right. Now we're driving through a section with some new housing under construction, but no sign of current work going on. And here we see piles of trash in the streets due to the lack of fuel for garbage trucks. We also saw smaller street-side garbage piles in the other towns and cities we visited earlier in the week. Here we are along Havana's coastal road, looking out over the Straits of Florida. Key West is about 100 miles to the right, which is due north. For our final evening, we visited Havana's very lively art center, housed in a former cooking oil factory, now given over to multiple large spaces devoted to art of all kinds, including painting, sculpture, video, and dancing. Here you're seeing a bar with dancing in the next room. Lots of Cubans were celebrating a Saturday night here at this very lively venue. We had dinner in the adjoining restaurant. The next morning, our tour taxi took us to the airport where we boarded our American Airlines flight to Miami. This final photo out the window shows Havana's harbor and coast with its white surf line. We had an action-packed week, allowing us to experience Cuba's natural beauty, but also interacting with the warm and friendly Cuban people. They are enduring increasing serious stresses as a result of the U.S.-imposed sanctions, now including oil. Tourism was a major component of the Cuban economy before the pandemic, but we saw very few other tourists. Now, several months later, tourism has dried up completely, adding to the other stresses being endured by the Cuban people.